Folks, today is a special day. You see, 1 year ago, we launched Build the Roster, a show I had been dreaming of and planning for ages. We kicked it off with Marvel Vs Capcom 4, where we pitched our dream roster for a hypothetical sequel to the Marvel series. And since then, Build the Roster has gone from a one-time idea to being our biggest series. And I cannot tell you how much that blows me away. I am so glad you guys have enjoyed this show, and I thank everyone out there who has supported it, who has spread the word on, and shared it around the web. So for the 1 year anniversary, we need to do something special. That's why today I'm finally breaking out the only game that could possibly top Marvel. A sequel that you have been asking me for all year long. A game that featured some of the biggest characters in fighting game history, crossed over multiple beloved series, and for many players out there, served as the introduction to the legendary SNK franchises. That's right. Today, we're going to build the roster for SNK Heroines Tag Team Frenzy 2. Yes, I can't believe it's finally happening either. At long last, we're going to get to follow the rich, deep story of Kukri and his harem of... Hello, I'm Aaron Bishop for News Combo 7. We interrupt this regularly scheduled video to talk about a much better game. 20 years ago, in Osaka, Japan, the Capcom Vs SNK Marvel the Millennium Tournament reached its conclusion when two mysterious figures appeared on the rooftops above. The battle between these two figures ended up resulting in the destruction of several city blocks. Since then, contestants from both the Capcom and SNK circuits have sworn never to cross paths again for fear that would result in another catastrophic event. However, rumors have begun to circulate that another tournament might be on the horizon. When asked to speculate on these rumors, a representative from the SNK side had this to say, and I quote, "Hey, come on, get serious, okay." Well, you heard it here, ladies and gentlemen. Could another tournament be on the way? And if it is, what fighters could we see joining the battle? We'll have all this and more tonight at 7. I have just been informed that we are not an actual news show, so there is no point in coming back at 7. I guess we can just start the episode now then. Hello everyone and welcome to Build the Roster, the show where we take a hypothetical fighting game and build our dream roster around it. Capcom and SNK. If you're an old arcade rat like I used to be, then you'll remember these two faces used to rule the fighting game community. Both of them pumping out hit after hit back in the day. It felt like almost every single time that I went to the arcade as a kid, there was some new Capcom machine in there, or the classic big red SNK box had a brand new label slapped up there. Now, I'll admit I was far more of a Capcom fan when I was a kid. I barely touched SNK back then, which, if you know me now, boy how the times have changed. Now I love the world of King of Fighters and the rest of the SNK universe, and when it comes to Capcom, yeah, I mostly just resort to making videos talking about how much I miss their older franchises. But what was it that got me to become so interested in SNK? What was my first exposure to this company? Simple. Capcom Vs SNK 2. I remember after I moved to college, I was going through a game store and found a used copy of it for the GameCube, decided what the heck, I'll check it out, and then for the next several months, that became the addiction of me and everyone else in my dorm. It became the #1 game that my friends and I played every chance that we got. And for good reason. This game took what the original CVS did and polished all the mechanics until it became a masterpiece. It took the world by storm, and for many Capcom fans like myself, it's the game that made us say, I need to know more about SNK. Who is this Rock Howard guy? He looks awesome. Terry Bogard? I don't know who he is, but ask if you're okay before he punches you with an exploding fist. How can you not love that? And what is with all the characters with swords? I need answers. If the point of a crossover game is to promote each party's brands, then I would argue Capcom vs SNK 2 was one of the most successful examples of that in history. Two titans coming together right at the peak of their popularity and influence to create something truly magical. And I say at their peak because, well, yeah, after this, the two companies went through some rough times. SNK continued putting out King of Fighters and Samurai Showdowns for several years, but then after they put all of their money into the sprite work for King of Fighters 12 and 13, they kind of, well, went bankrupt.
I declare bankruptcy!
Since then, they've been passed around from one owner to another, and for many years, people thought they were kinda dead. Heck, even to this day, SNK fans are worried about who could potentially be the new owner of that company, but that is some dark behind-the-scenes stuff that we're not going to get into here. And as for Capcom, yeah, if you don't know the history of Capcom's fighting games and how it went from this to this, then I can only assume that you're new to this channel, so hi there, feel free to look around and hit that subscribe button and ring that bell. Cool, thanks. However, after barely scraping through these dark times, both companies have recently seen an upturn. After years of everyone thinking SNK was dead, they put out the critically praised King of Fighters 14, and even though it didn't do gangbusters sales, it did sell relatively well compared to other King of Fighters games, so to SNK that was a win. In fact, they took it as such a win that they decided to bring back Samurai Showdown as well, which actually became one of the highest selling SNK games ever. And now King of Fighters 15 is on track to continue that success. And as for Capcom, well, they still have a lot of ground that they have to recover, but after a recent shakeup in their fighting game department, it actually looks like things are turning around for them. It actually feels like people who like Capcom fighting games are now making Capcom fighting games. So does this mean that maybe, possibly, we could one day see a brand new Capcom vs SNK? Actually, I'll be honest with all of you. I originally wrote no in the script here. All that talk of success was going to be a giant fake out. It was all leading up to me saying, there's never going to be a Capcom vs SNK 3. But literally just a month ago, as I was working on this script, SNK put out on the Switch SNK vs Capcom Match of the Millennium. The very first time this classic crossover game has ever been re-released. And in order for this to happen, it means the two companies did actually have to come to some kind of an understanding, so yeah, screw me, what do I know? Maybe all this recent success, maybe all these crossovers, maybe these re-releases, maybe it could actually mean something. Maybe we could actually see Capcom vs SNK 3 someday. So today on Build the Roster, in honor of this recent re-release, giving us all some hope again, and in honor of the 1-year anniversary of this show, as well as the 20-year anniversary of Capcom vs SNK 2, we're going to pretend like the head of the Capcom and SNK families came together and worked out a deal, and now we get to build a roster for their next game. Now, like with every episode of Build the Roster, we have to start with the question, how many characters? How big is this roster going to be? And if you watched this show before, then you know I usually go into some big, crazy, overly complicated equation to explain how I wound up with our roster size, but not today. The roster size today is 48, because that's how many characters were in the last King of Fighters game. 48 regular characters and 2 unlockable bosses. And if the last big SNK game had 48 characters in it, we can't exactly have the SNK and Capcom crossover game have less than that. That just looks bad. Why would you buy a game crossing over 2 franchises when you can stick to 1 and get more characters? And it's not like that's a crazy number for this franchise either, including the 2 unlockable bosses Capcom vs SNK 2 had, guess what, 48 characters. That's kind of our magic number. So you see, that wasn't so bad, was it? I don't always have to make these rosters overly complicated. No, they can be simple. I don't have to make them complicated. I don't need to complicate them. I don't need. I need it! Okay, fine, here goes. Yes, our roster size is going to be 48 regular characters to start, with a few unlockable bosses thrown in on top. That is true, that is easy, and if that is all you care about, then I would like to take this moment to remind everyone that we do always write the time code down below, so if you want to skip right to the characters, then go for it, no hard feelings here. But if you are sticking around, well, now that we've explained how many characters we're picking, now we have to explain why we're picking them. I know you might be thinking, why do you need to explain something like that? Just pick the most popular Capcom characters and the most popular SNK characters, get 24 of each of them, bam, you're done. Well, here's the thing. Capcom vs SNK don't work like that. I have been talking about doing this episode for a long time, almost since the very first episode went up a year ago, and I have seen a lot of people pop up with their recommendations, which is always appreciated. I always enjoy seeing what you guys think. However, I saw a lot of people throwing out their picks for the Capcom side saying, yeah, let's get Dante and Asura and Amaterasu in there, and I'm about to break your hearts right now because that will not be happening. But why, you might ask? Why wouldn't you include these big popular characters? Well, because you see, Capcom Vs SNK isn't like any other crossover series. You see, a lot of crossover games, heck, not even games, just crossover properties in general, are about the biggest names coming together. They're about realities colliding and the fate of two worlds hanging in the balance. Yeah, not here. No, the premise of Capcom Vs SNK is, hey, what would happen if the Street Fighter cast got invited to the King of Fighters tournament? Yeah, that's basically it. It's what if the postman finally found Ryu's address and handed him that letter from Rugal. I'm not making that up either. That's literally the premise. The story of the first Capcom vs SNK was just the Masters Foundation and the Garcia Financial Clique came together and hosted a fighting tournament. That was it. No universes crashing together, no giant megalomaniacal villains opening up portals to new worlds, no strange artifact full of unlimited power, no, just Ken and Robert Garcia's families decided to have a party and invite all their friends. Yeah, the Capcom vs SNK series was essentially just Street Fighter vs King of Fighters, and you can really see that in the cast. In the first game, Morgan was the only Capcom character not from Street Fighter, and Nakaruru was the only character not from a game in the King of Fighters universe. Street Fighter Cross Tekken had a wider variety of franchises being represented. And in the sequel, they added a little more variety, but about 9% of the cast still came from just 2 series. And I know what a lot of people are going to say, yes, this is how the previous 2 installments were, but that was just so Capcom could recycle their Street Fighter Alpha sprites. We shouldn't just stick to these 2 franchises for the sequel. Yes, you're right, we should change up the roster and expand it. But that doesn't mean we should change up the tone. Yes, to repeat what I said earlier, the premise of Capcom vs SNK isn't 2 worlds colliding and the strongest characters of these realities having to come together to stop it. No, it's basically, what if we held the greatest fighting tournament of all time? And I love that. I love that that was the theme of the series. I love that you can feel that in the stages, the music, the interactions, and the combat. Capcom vs SNK didn't feel like gods whipping and zipping and dipping and flipping all over the screen with maximum triple-digit combos. No, it felt like the best elements of Capcom and SNK fighting games merged together. I mean, heck, that's what the groove system was all about, and that was one of the best things in the game. And that was the point of Capcom vs SNK. Remember, in the late 90s and early 2000s, when they crossed over, they were the 2 kings of fighting games. It was the company behind Street Fighter, Darkstalkers, Rival School, and Marvel going up against the company behind King of Fighters, Galro, Samurai Showdown, Last Blade, and so much more. And this game was designed to celebrate that. It was the kings of the arcade celebrating what they had in common. So when we build this roster today, that's what I'm going to focus on. This is once again going to be the greatest fighting tournament of all time, meaning the contestants will be people who you would expect to find in a fighting tournament. So in other words, Chris Redfield is not going to step into the ring because he thinks someone on the SNK side is secretly a tyrant. Phoenix Wright is not going to find that the best way to defend his client is by taking matters to the street. And do I even need to explain why Asura and Amaterasu wouldn't work in here? So yes, sorry to rip that band-aid off, but we did have to establish Capcom vs SNK is the world's greatest fighting tournament, and the roster will reflect that as much as it can. I will split off from this theme a bit here and there to try and provide more variety. Not everyone is going to be a fighting game character, but for the most part, these contestants will be people who settle their issues in the ring. Now, this doesn't mean that we can't have cameos from other characters all over the place. No, not at all. The previous CVS games were loaded with guest stars on the stages, and I say we keep that going. Put in as many Easter eggs as you can. Heck, bring back News Combo 7 and have it hosted by Frank West and Clemens Bellamy, with Cub reporter Ron Hibiki interviewing fighters between matches to get their win screen quotes. We can still celebrate characters even if they're not in the main roster. So okay, now that my TED Talk on the nature of this game is over and I've discussed in length how I'm going to try and stay true to the tone of the original, it's time to talk about what we're going to do different. Yes, if you watched Build the Roster before, then you know that I can't just leave it at the roster. I always have to have one crazy idea that I throw into the mix. One challenge that I give myself to make things interesting. And when it comes to Capcom vs SNK 3, my crazy idea is going to take a premise from the previous games and lean into it even further. Am I referring to the groove system? No. I mean, Don't get me wrong, the groove system would return from the previous games with 6 brand new systems, many based around more recent Capcom and SNK games. But that's gameplay stuff. We're not here to talk about gameplay stuff. We're here to talk about the roster, and that's why I have to bring up my crazy idea here and now. You see, Capcom Vs SNK was a team fighter, and in these games, you could pick anywhere between 1 and 3 characters and divvy up a total of 4 points between them to decide how strong they would be. Meaning, you could have 1 character on your team and make them a total tank, or you could have 2 or 3 characters with varying strength between them. Now, divvying up your strength was something totally unique to this series, but the rest of the team format took heavy inspiration from King of Fighters. In both games, you would decide the order of your team when you start the match. Each character would fight until they lost, and then the next fighter would come in, and if you won, then you would gain some of your health back. And I love that this was essentially Capcom doing their own take on SNK's big fighting franchise. But there was something about this team format that King of Fighters had that Capcom vs SNK was missing. Canonical teams. Yes, in King of Fighters, just like in Capcom vs SNK, you could pick whatever combination of characters you wanted. But every character in KOF is part of a canonical story-related team of 3. If you pick that team, then you'll get their ending in arcade mode. And that's the idea I'm going to bring to Capcom vs SNK 3. As I said, we're going with 48 characters on the main roster, and 48 is divisible by 2, meaning that we'll have 24 Capcom characters and 24 SNK characters. But 24 is divisible by 3, meaning I'm not picking 24 characters on both sides, I'm picking 8 teams on both sides. That is my challenge to myself on this episode, and believe you me, this threw a massive curveball into this roster. There were so many more things that I had to consider. Seriously, I had to pick 16 teams in total, and by the time I was done, I had about 50 crazy combinations. Why do I do this to myself, you might ask? I don't know. Clearly, I have some kind of a problem, but that's neither here nor there. Let me go into some details about what I mean when I say this complicated matters. A lot. I couldn't just pick 3 characters at random and stick them on a team. No, the characters had to have something in common. Either they came from a shared background, they have their own stories that already tie into each other, or sometimes they just have to have personalities that line up and feel like they get along. Which does mean that if a character already belongs to a canonical team of 3 in their own stories, then it did give that team an advantage when I was considering them. But I would then have to consider the weight and importance of all 3 characters on that canonical team and average them out. In other words, if you have 1 character that is very popular and important to the franchise, but their 2 canonical team members are, well, none of those things, I would have to ask myself if that 1 popular character was big enough to carry the load of their 2 teammates, or if those 2 teammates were unappealing enough to drag that 1 popular character down to the mud with them. And just to clarify to the people out there who are saying, well, I don't want to play on a preset team, I want to build my own team. Again, you can still totally do that. You just won't get a special ending if you do, which you didn't get in the last game either, so if you want to mix and match, you can still totally do that and will feel just like the last game. But if you do enjoy arcade endings in your fighting games, if you do enjoy unique interactions between characters coming together, then you can now pick these canonical teams when you go through the arcade ladder. So okay, to reiterate, because I know I just covered a lot, we are going to stick to the theme and tone of the previous games. Meaning, when choosing these characters, we have to ask if they fit in a fighting game, and specifically, would their fighting style fit the speed and pacing of the combat in this game, or would they be too big and crazy to match? And then, after that, we have to look at these characters and put them into teams of 3 to create canonical teams for the arcade endings. Seems like we went a really long way for something I could sum up in 15 seconds, but I wouldn't be me if I didn't over-explain the crap out of everything. That's it, the time for talking is over. Now is the time for action. So ladies and gentlemen, I present to you, not your 48 characters, but instead, your 16 teams.
This is the path of my destiny.
Let's turn up the heat. Finish this! It's over!
Team World Warriors. I need to create a team that would essentially be Team Street Fighter. That team that when you think of Capcom's biggest fighting game franchise, you think of them. And for me, that came down to Ken, Ryu, and Chun-Li. These 3 have been in the most installments in the franchise. They're 3 of the biggest fighting game figures in the world, and they even have a canonical friendship among themselves within the game. Putting them together just seems obvious, right? Well, it wasn't as easy as you might think. Chun-Li almost didn't make it on here simply because as I divide up the Capcom roster, she wound up being a perfect fit for more combinations of teams than any other character. Heck, up until the last second, I actually had her on Team Interpol with Cammy and Guile, and Ryu and Ken were going to be joined by their master Gouken. I mean, Chun-Li has canonically been teammates with Guile and Cammy for years, and it felt like it might be good to see Ken and Ryu fight alongside their master, but no matter how much I tried to justify that, it meant I would have a team of 3 Shotos together. Heck, not just Shotos, 3 Shotokans. 3 characters who all fought with the exact same techniques, just with slight variations between them. So instead, I bumped their old master off and decided that the Mount Rushmore of Capcom fighting games would form our first team. Now, we just made what is essentially Team Street Fighter, so that means for SNK's first team, we have to go with...
This battle is about to explode.
Team Hero. Yes, if you're going to have a team that's the face of Street Fighter, we need a team that's the face of King of Fighters. And over the course of its long life, there have been multiple teams that have used the title Team Hero and focused on the current protagonist of a game. So when I think of who would be the official representatives of King of Fighters, I of course think of Kyo, the original protagonist of the series, keeper of one of the 3 sacred treasures, and winner of more King of Fighters tournaments than any other character. Next would be Benimaru, Kyo's best friend who has constantly been there by his side, and even when he does join another team, it's typically with someone who is important to the overall plot of the game, keeping Benimaru in the spotlight. And we need someone to represent the most recent wave of KOF, so of course the most obvious choice is Shun'ei. Now, I know people are still kind of hot and cold on Shun'ei. Some people love him for his gameplay, while some people hate him because... well, look at him. Yeah, this is what happens when you let the all-powerful kid chosen by Destiny dress himself. He's one giant key away from being a Kingdom Hearts character. But I still had to pick him because if we want someone to represent the modern day of King of Fighters, we should probably go with the current protagonist. For anyone who doesn't know, King of Fighters works in arcs, with every 3 or 4 games all being collected together in one storyline with a new character being the protagonist of those games. And starting with KOF 14, Shun'ei's been our newest star. Now, granted, King of Fighters 15 has yet to come out, so our exposure to him is still fairly limited, but as I said, he is who they're pushing as the new face of the game, so you know if Capcom Vs SNK 3 got made, SNK would be pretty adamant about him being included. And it even makes sense. I mean, Kyo and Benimaru have been on a team forever, so of course they would pair up. And we know that in King of Fighters 15, Kyo is asking Benimaru to join Shun'ei's team to help mentor him, so these 3 could totally come together. And I know some people might be upset that Goro is being left off Kyo and Benny's team, but he's always the member of Team Japan to be left off whenever they need a slot. He didn't even make it into the first 2 CVSs, so don't worry, he's used to this. He'll go home and be a family man, he's fine.
Live and let die.
Back after the ultimate improvement!
Uh-oh. Pleased to meet you.
This time, Jimmy, me and you and Sakura, we're getting in, and we're gonna show the world just how awesome the Sakyo arts truly are!
Team Psycho Style. Alright, remember how I said if there actually was a canonical team of 3 characters already set up in these games, then they would get special treatment? Here you go. Dan, Sakura, and Blanca are canonically all friends in the Street Fighter universe and have hung out and trained before over the course of several games. But even beyond them just being a pre-existing team, it's a pretty solid set of characters to boot. You got Blanca, one of the original World Warriors from Street Fighter 2, so he's got history with this franchise. Then you got Sakura, one of the most popular fighting game characters of all time. No, seriously, that's not an opinion. Capcom did a poll of the most popular Street Fighter characters, and she came in at number 1. She is definitely a big enough name that you need to include her in this roster. And then there's Dan. Dan. Oh, Dan. You have to include Dan Hibiki in Capcom Vs SNK. That's not an exaggeration. You have to include him. For anyone who doesn't know the origin of Dan Hibiki, back in the 90s, SNK launched a certain game that featured many characters that Capcom looked at and said, those are just our characters. You're totally ripping us off. So Capcom, in turn, created Dan Hibiki to be a parody of the characters from that game, and then made him a joke character who was incredibly weak, specifically to make fun of SNK. And since then, any time that SNK and Capcom have crossed over, Dan has always been in the roster as sort of a way of these two companies looking at each other and saying, we're just kidding, no hard feelings, oh, we have fun, don't we? Yeah, in these crossover games, Dan Hibiki is sort of the olive branch between Capcom and SNK. So we had to work him in here somewhere, and the fact that he comes from his own built-in 3-person team just cements his placement. But that's only half of the equation, because if we're including Dan and his team, we have to include the team that would be their rivals, the original rip-offs that Dan proceeded to rip off.
Go for broke!
Team Art of Fighting! Yes, the Art of Fighting team is a tradition in King of Fighters. It was one of SNK's early breakout fighting game series, and as I said, it's kind of the other half of the Dan Hibiki coin. The joke of putting Dan in Capcom vs SNK only works if you include at least some of the characters he was ripping off. But again, I'm not just going to include them for the joke. The Art of Fighting characters are kind of a big chunk of that SNK pie. However, when it comes to the Art of Fighting team in King of Fighters, it's typically the exact same lineup over and over again with very few changes. There's typically only about 4 or max 5 different characters that end up on this team. However, for this installment, I'm going to spice things up a little bit in order to create a little more variety of characters. The first 2 members, however, are going to be obvious choices. You got Ryo, the face of Art of Fighting. Then you got his sister Yuri, a super popular character within the SNK universe. She was essentially Sakura before Sakura, and yes, I see the irony of Capcom accusing Art of Fighting of ripping off a Street Fighter character, and then a few years later they ended up accidentally creating a Street Fighter character that was pretty much a ripoff of an Art of Fighting character. But for the final slot, I hate doing this to Robert Garcia, but he will sadly, once again, not be joining his teammates. I know it's unfair that his family sponsored the first game, and yet he's never even been on the ticket, but he will once again have to sit out this CVS. Because taking his spot is a character I've been saying for years needs to finally join the Art of Fighting team. Marco Rodriguez, or as he is known in the English translation, Kushnud Butt. Has there ever been a character who got a worse deal in the English translation? This is like a Phoenix Wright joke name. Now, Kushnud is a fan-favorite character because of his crazy aggressive fighting style and his big bombastic personality, and since he originates from Gauro Mark of the Wolves, if I include him in this roster, it expands our range further than just the King of Fighters cast. But most importantly, despite being a disciple of Ryo, despite appearing in the Art of Fighting stages, despite appearing in Art of Fighting team endings, he still hasn't moved over to the King of Fighters to join the Art of Fighting team. So if this game allows me to finally make that happen, heck yes, I'm going to take that opportunity. Also, this would be a good time to finally bring this up. One of the best things about the last CVS were the character interactions, where specific fighters would have unique lines or actions before a match when facing a specific opponent. And I would absolutely bring that back. Either once again have unique intro animations, or just unique dialogue exchanges between characters before the match. But since we're doing 3 character teams in here, I would suggest actually having unique intro scenes, not just between specific characters, but between specific teams. And the exchange between Psycho Style and Art of Fighting practically writes itself. Whether it be in the arcade ladder or the story mode or whatever this game ends up having, I would love to see Dan and Ryo accusing each other of copying their styles. Then Sakura and Yuri are 2 sides of the same coin, so they find an equal opponent in each other. And lastly, you got Kushnud and Blanca, 2 Brazilian fighters who trained alongside animals in the forest. This lines up so well, it justifies the entire idea of having character interactions.
This is gonna be a match to remember.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Turn the beat back.
Team Metro City. This was another no-brainer. It's one of the most well-established three-person teams in Capcom's history. Ever since the first Final Fight game came out over 30 years ago, these three have been the face of Capcom's beat-em-up games. Which, yes, I know I said that we were mostly going to focus on fighting game properties, but beat-em-ups and fighting games have always been genres separated at birth, so it totally works. Plus, it's not like these characters didn't eventually make their way over towards the fighting side of the family anyways. Cody and Guy both went on to become regulars in Street Fighter, and Hagar became the Final Fight representative in Marvel, as well as starring in the early Capcom wrestling franchise Saturday Night Slam Masters, so they totally fit the theme. And just speaking in terms of gameplay, these three are a great combo. You got Guy for speed, Hagar for strength, and then Cody for a nice balance between the two with a few tricks and gimmicks to help keep the opponent on their toes. Also, you could still give Cody his various weapons from the games, like pipes or knives, but you could tie them to the different groove systems, allowing him to show off how these different meters could really change up the combat. For example, let's say that you create a groove based around the gameplay in Street Fighter V, so each character would have a V skill that they could use. And for Cody, when you activate that V skill, he would pull out his knife. But you could also create a groove based around King of Fighters 14, where characters could burn a meter to go into max mode, and while in this mode, Cody would pull out his pipe. Not every character should have this much variety in the groove systems, but we should have a few characters that really lean into this mechanic and show off its potential, and Cody is a great choice for that.
Go for broke.
Come on!
Team Fatal Fury. Okay, now is when we have to start getting creative with these teams in order to make sure that the widest range of characters can be included. Because if you're a longtime King of Fighters fan, then you know Terry and Kim are rarely ever on the same team together, having only teamed up in one installment, and Mai, while being obsessed with Terry's brother Andy, has only officially been on the team once or twice. But in order to build a roster with the widest variety and to include the biggest name characters, I had to shuffle around some of the regular cast members and get creative, which left us with this team. Terry Bogard, one of the most popular fighting game characters of all time, and he's practically Mr. SNK, the face of this company. Heck, he even made it into Smash Bros. As the representative of this age of arcade fighters. You have to include Terry. Someone has to check and see if everyone is okay. Then there's Kim Kapwan. He's a big fan favorite. His strong sense of justice is a great recurring joke that would be perfect to put in here for character interactions, and his crazy fast kicks have made him a strong competitive fighter for many installments. And then there's Mai, who is essentially SNK's Chun-Li. She's probably the most famous female character that this company has. And as I said, yes, each of these three characters typically come from their own teams, with Terry typically being the leader of Team Fatal Fury, while Mai is usually on Team Woman Fighters, and Kim typically belongs to Team Korean Justice and later just joined Team Kim, but all three of them originated from the Fatal Fury series. All three of them have a long history with each other, and they have, even if it was rarely, fought on the same team. So while I will admit this is the weirdest Team Fatal Fury ever put together, it's the team that we need for this game to get the most big name characters in here.
You can feel the calm before the storm as the round begins.
Welcome to the world of Street Fighter 3. Prepare for battle. Yeah.
Team Third Strike. This is another group of characters that felt sorely missing from Capcom Vs SNK 2. Street Fighter 3, specifically the third installment, has gone on to become one of the biggest fighting games in history. However, it received almost no representation in Capcom Vs SNK 2, with Yun being the only character from that game to appear in there. But it's understandable why. I mean, not only was Capcom primarily using sprites from the Alpha series, so they probably didn't want to mix them together, but also Street Fighter 3 took a while before everyone started to see how brilliant it was and the FGC really fell in love with it. Heck, if CVS 2 had been made just a year later, we probably would have seen a few more characters popping up in there. So to correct this decision, we're going to give the Street Fighter 3 characters their own team, called Team Third Strike because...
You know what they say, the third strike is what counts.
Also, this is a 3-person tournament, so the name kinda works. For this team, I'm going with Alex, the protagonist of Street Fighter 3, and another grappler, which is always good to have around just to provide this roster with some variety. Dudley, one of the more popular characters from the game, who would provide a good combination of close-range pressure and psychological mix-ups. And Makoto, who... Listen, I could go into details about her playstyle, but real talk, Makoto is in here because she is one of the most popular Street Fighter characters of all time. Remember that popularity poll where Sakura was number 1? Makoto was number 2. And she's been in almost no games. And yet people still love her that much. And hey, I say this almost every episode of this show, but popularity isn't everything. However, it sure is something. So if that many people love you, then I don't see any reason not to use you. In fact, while we're on the subject of Makoto, let me address something that a lot of her fans might be about to bring up in the comments down below, which is that there is another team that I almost put her on. If you know the Street Fighter comics, then you know that she goes to school with Ibuki and Elena, so that would be the obvious choice for her team. But first off, the Street Fighter comics aren't canon. Except for when they are. Yeah, it's kind of weird how they pick and choose what counts, but it's been strongly implied by the developers that this particular story doesn't count. And secondly, while I do want to include teams that make sense, i.e. teams that already exist within their universes, sometimes you have to sacrifice the obvious team for a team that includes more variety and popular choices. I mean, if I could squeeze about 2 or 3 more teams on each side of this roster, then heck yes, this would be Makoto's team. But sadly, because I have to limit the size to a reasonable amount, she'll be teaming up with Alex and Dudley. And for anyone wondering why they would all team up, I could see Dudley wanting to enter this tournament, so he hires Alex to be his partner because Alex beat Gil. You know, the guy who stole Dudley's car? That just makes sense to me that he wanted to recruit him. And Makoto would be so desperate to get into this tournament to bring glory to her dojo that the moment that she hears there's a team looking for a third member, she would travel halfway across the world and break down the doors and shove her way onto this team. Again, I will admit it is a weird pairing, but it could work, and I do kind of love thinking of how these very different personalities would bounce off each other.
That's what we like to call big damage.
Team Mark of the Wolves. Yes, if you have a Team Third Strike, then you need a Team Mark of the Wolves. Galro Mark of the Wolves was often referred to as SNK's attempt to compete with Third Strike as they released just a few months apart. And while Mark of the Wolves didn't go on to be as beloved as Third Strike, it is still to this day considered one of SNK's best fighting games and introduced so many new characters that fans have come to love. In fact, one of SNK's most popular characters, Rock Howard, made his debut in this game. And yet, it wasn't until he appeared in Capcom Vs SNK 2 that his popularity exploded as so many Capcom fans picked this game up, saw this character for the first time, and fell in love with him. So considering that the last CVS put this character on the map, we're going to let him lead his own team in the sequel. And joining Rock Howard on this team is going to be T-Zoc, because not only does it provide the game with yet another grappler, so that way fans of these types of characters will have a large variety to choose from, but also because T-Zoc has gone to be one of the few Mark of the Wolves characters to have a recurring role in the King of Fighters game. In fact, let me go ahead and address this right now. I know that a lot of people might be arguing that rather than using his heroic Griffin persona, we should include his latest heel turn moniker, King of Dinosaurs. Listen, I love T-Zoc's King of Dinosaurs personality. It's great, but at the time of this recording, we still don't know if he's going to keep that for upcoming games. He's only used it in King of Fighters 14, and we have no idea what the future holds for this character. So in order to play it safe, we're going to have T-Zoc stick with his hero personality. And as for their third member, this was kind of hard because there certainly are several memorable characters from Galro that we could choose. Hinata has her fan base, Gato has stuck around to appear in a few games beyond Galro, and when it comes to character interactions, I think either of Kim Kapoan's sons would make great additions. But I feel like Bijane does the best job of capturing all these elements. She has her fans, people want to see more of her, And after Mark of the Wolf, she did manage to reappear in a couple KOF games, so she has proven that she has staying power. Plus, just speaking in terms of personality, I think she is the clear winner out of this bunch. She's a pirate and a happy-go-lucky thief. So if we're talking about characters that would have good interactions with other people on this roster, I think she is hands down the winner.
Check it out!
From the darkest depths of the underworld, we are resurrected. We are mankind's worst nightmare, and only salvation. We are Dark Stalkers.
Team Night Warriors. As I said, originally Morgan was the only Capcom character not from Street Fighter to be represented in this series, so it just makes sense to give the Darkstalkers their own team. But picking who to put on here was kind of a tough choice because, yeah, I'll admit I have some teams so far that are made up of characters who wouldn't really work together before, like Team Third Strike, but at least the characters on those teams are still willing to work with people. Most of the Darkstalkers are notorious for being loners, so I decided to start off with Felicia and John Talbane. Not only is Felicia one of the biggest and most recognizable faces in the series, and John Talbane is easily the winner of Capcom's Why Has This Guy Not Appeared in Anything Else award, being a massive fan favorite in the Darkstalker series and yet sadly has not appeared in anything since those games. But also, these are two of the only characters in the series to canonically work together. So, if Felicia wanted to join this tournament and she needed teammates, she would of course go to John Talbane for help. Also, I'd love to see Talbane's exchanges with some of the SNK characters. Imagine him going up against T-Zoc, who is convinced that Talbane is another luchador and the wolf outfit is a super elaborate costume. Now, as for who would be their third team member, well, Felicia and Talbane are two of the heroic characters in Darkstalkers, so we need another hero, which automatically limits our choices quite a bit. Most Darkstalkers are either villains or at least chaotically neutral. But out of all the remaining heroic characters, I feel like Hisinko would be the most comfortable teaming up with these two. She's got a sense of honor that would line up with Talbane, but also she's got that sense of fun and wonder to her that would match with Felicia. Now, I know some of you might be wondering why I didn't pick Morgan, since she was the Darkstalker representative in the previous game. Well, because A, Morgan wasn't just the Darkstalker representative in that game, she's the Darkstalker representative in everything. If I have a chance in here to include other characters, I will gladly take it. And B, well, we're not done with the list just yet, and let's just say, I might still have some plans for Morgan down the line.
Here we go!
Team K-Dash. This team feels like it's almost mandatory to make up for the fact that somehow they missed out on being in the last game. As I said with Shun'ei, King of Fighters changes its story and its protagonist every 3 or 4 installments, and Kyo's story wrapped up in KOF 98. Then, starting King of Fighters 99, was the Nest Saga, which was a story about a mysterious organization attempting to create an army of clones, because that's just what you did back in the 90s, you made clones. The hero of that story was K-Dash, a mysterious man who had been experimented upon by Nest to gain flame powers. Eventually, he broke free of Nest's control and was joined by Maxima, a cyborg soldier who also rebelled against Nest when he saw what the organization was doing to their test subjects, and Kula, a young child with ice powers who, despite her carefree, playful attitude, was basically Nest's secret weapon and even began as the big rival to K-Dash. Since their inception, they've gone on to be one of the biggest and, no pun intended, coolest teams in the King of Fighters franchise. And yet, as I said, no members of this team were in Capcom Vs SNK 2, despite the fact that the games starring K-Dash were coming out at the exact time that the last CVS came out. I say all the time that when you make a roster, you need to include the new hotness, again, no pun intended, and this guy was the new hotness during CVS 2. And they just said, nah, let's just stick with the classics. So yeah, we're going to correct that in this installment, and we're going to include K-Dash, a man so awesome he attacks you with his sunglasses, Kula, the candy-loving ice princess, and Maxima, the greatest Canadian fighting game character of all time. Suck it, Abigail.
Oh man, are you ready for this?
This place shall become your grave! So be it. I'll fight you on your own level!
Team Shadaloo. This is another super obvious team. I mean, this has been the biggest villain team in Capcom fighting game history, and lucky for us, they just happen to be a 3-person team. I know that some people right now will argue that's actually more than that since Shadaloo has had multiple members over the years, but when you get down to it, these are the 3 that matter. Sure, there was Sagat, but he quit and went on the path of righteousness to help people. He wouldn't exactly team back up with this group of villains again. Then there's Junie, Julie, and all the other dolls, but they're not really distinct enough to warrant a slot. And then there's Fong.
You fool! I'll never forgive you! What? Intruders? I understand. I'll get back there right now!
Hey, wait!
We will not be using Fong. So if you want a group that will represent the face of Shadaloo, it has been and always will be the 3 legendary kings, Boxer, Claw, and Dictator, aka Balrog, Vega, and M. Bison. I don't even feel like I need to keep explaining this one. It's another pre-establishing 3-person team, and it's incredibly important to the history of the company. Let's just move on.
Great! I knew that groove was in your heart.
Ha! かかっておいで、ベイビー。甘く見られて。
Team Women Fighters. Another classic team in the King of Fighters series, and for our purposes here today, a very important team. Because originally, Team Women Fighters was created by King when Mai couldn't join Team Fatal Fury, and Yuri couldn't join Team Art of Fighting, so she decided to put together her own team to show all the male fighters that they could be just as strong as they were. Why is that important to us? Because unlike many of the other teams on here that follow a specific theme and the members of those teams have to hit very specific requirements to join, to be part of Team Women Fighters, you just have to be 2 things. A woman and a fighter. Meaning this is the perfect spot to put characters who needed to be in this game, but we couldn't figure out where else they should go. The leader would of course be King. She's been the head of this team since the start and has remained one of the most iconic SNK characters for almost 30 years now. Then after that, we'll include Athena Asamiya. Now, she was a tough one to pick because while she has a lot of fans, the people that don't like her really don't like her. Gee, I can't imagine why. But despite her haters, she's constantly ranked in the top 10 most popular SNK characters, and considering how many characters fans have to choose from, yeah, that really says a lot. So she does have a strong fan base, and she is an iconic character for the company. But you know who doesn't have a strong fan base and isn't iconic to the company? Her teammates on Team Psycho Soldiers. Yeah, old drunk man and kid who likes meat buns? Believe it or not, they don't really connect with the fans all that much. They're constantly ranked low on fan polls. Luckily, even though she's never been on Team Women Fighters, she does meet the qualifications for it, so she'll be joined up for this round. And for the 3rd spot, we're going to go with Hibiki Takane, who, just like Athena, has never been a part of this team before, but unlike Athena, she doesn't even exist in the same universe as King and her team. Hibiki is from Last Blade, a completely different franchise, but we had to give Last Blade at least some representation on this list. Not only was it a critically acclaimed series back in the day, but also it was one of the first games that SNK implemented rollback netcode into, which brought in a modern day audience for that game. And if I had to pick just one character from that series to be in this game, I'd go with Hibiki. Out of all the characters from Last Blade, she's one of the only ones whose popularity has allowed her to survive beyond that game, as just recently it was announced that she was going to be coming to the new Samurai Showdown game as DLC. And she was even the Last Blade representative in Capcom Vs SNK 2, so yeah, she's the obvious choice, and as I said, there's a team sitting right here that she perfectly fits the criteria for.
This battle is about to explode.
Team Taiyo Academy. To a younger Capcom fan out there, this team might seem odd, but if you know, then you know. Taiyo Academy, the team made up of Batsu, Hinata, and Kyosuke, comes from the games Rival Schools and Project Justice. And when I put together one of these Build the Roster episodes, I love to throw around the term fan favorite as justification for why we should include a character. But I don't know if I have ever used that term with more fervor than I am using it right now. I love Rival Schools, so much so that we kicked off our new series fighting game retrospectives with almost an hour-long look back at the franchise. And I'm not alone in this. Fans of this series have been outspoken in their love for the games, begging Capcom to continue it on in one way or another, and after almost 2 decades of nothing, Akira Kazama, arguably the most popular character in the game, is coming to Street Fighter, meaning these characters will finally get to live on in one way or another. But Aaron, you ask, that's all well and good, but just because people like these characters doesn't mean they would fit in here. Does Rival Schools fit the insane set of rules that you established at the beginning of this episode? Rival Schools fits the format of this hypothetical game that I'm putting together better than probably any other Capcom game I'm including. As I said, I'm making Capcom Vs SNK 3, a game made up of 3 character teams, because not only does that match the theme of the previous games, but it also serves as a celebration of the team-based format of King of Fighters. You know what other fighting game series relied on a 3-person team layout? Rival Schools. The first game, Rival Schools, include 3-person teams to represent each of the schools. However, because of hardware limitations at the time, you could only pick 2 characters to play as. But then in Project Justice, you could now pick all 3 characters at once. There is no way we can put this roster together without at least including 1 team from that game in here. And as I said, Akira is arguably the most popular character in the game, but she's already getting into Street Fighter. Let's use this chance to give some screen time to some other characters, and the most obvious choice is Taiyo Academy's team. Not only was Taiyo High the protagonist team of the game, meaning they're the best choice to be the face of the franchise, but Kyosuke was even in the last Capcom Vs SNK. Heck, he wasn't just in the game, they put him right on the cover. So bringing him back will be a good way to link this game to the last.
Here we go.
武士道とは死ぬことと見つけたり、修羅道とは倒すことと見つけたり、我悪鬼羅刹となりて目の前の敵すべてを切る。
お前さんが相手かい。泣きを見ても知らねえぜ。
Team Samurai Showdown. So far, when it comes to SNK, I've mostly been focusing on King of Fighters characters because A, it's kind of SNK's biggest fighting game franchise, and B, since King of Fighters itself is a crossover game, it literally consumes every one of the other fighting game franchises from SNK. Art of Fighting, Fatal Fury, it all exists within the King of Fighters universe, so even if I pick characters from other SNK franchises, it means I'm picking King of Fighters characters. Except for Samurai Showdown. This is the one corner of their universe that still remains its own thing. Well, mostly. I mean, Nakaruru was in King of Fighters 14, but she was on Team Otherworld, so even though she was in that game, her entire premise was that she was still separate and from another world, and listen, that's not important. Point is, it's time to talk Samurai Showdown. It's one of SNK's longest running franchises, and its most recent installment from 2 years ago has actually gone on to be one of the company's highest selling games of all time. Heck, I'm shocked it took me this long to get to this team. They're that important. Now, to begin with, there's the 2 most obvious picks. Halmaru, the protagonist of the series, the Blade Master himself, and the intended face of the franchise. Then there's Nakaruru, the actual face of the franchise. Yeah, the little falcon-wielding priestess has gone on to appear in more promotional material for the company than any other Sam Show character, and when SNK had to come back from near death and revive themselves with King of Fighters 14, they decided to finally put a Sam Show character in here, knowing it could possibly be the last time any of these characters could be seen. So who was the character they chose to represent the series? Not Halmaru, I'll tell you that. So Halmaru and Nakaruru are obvious choices, but who would be our third character? Well, I did consider putting Galford in here. Him and his dog Poppy are pretty fun characters, and with their strong sense of justice, it would be fun to pair him up against characters like Kim. Plus, when King of Fighters was first created in '94, they did actually consider making a Team Samurai Showdown with Haomaru, Nakaruru, and Galford as the team, so putting all three of them together could be a fun reference to that. But right now, this roster is full of way too many classic characters. We need some fresh blood. We need some big recent additions to the company. So I am going with Darlie Dagger. She was introduced in the latest installment of the game, and to say she blew up is, well, a bit of an understatement. People love this character. Her design, her attitude, her massive saw blade, the fact that her victory pose is just her chugging a giant barrel of alcohol. All of it came together to make her a breakout star, and she definitely deserves to be a Samurai Showdown representative in this game. Alright, there's only one more team for Capcom, and so far, I've been pretty basic. I've been choosing teams that make sense. Everyone is sticking to their own franchises and teaming up with characters that they would naturally associate with, but we need at least one weird team. We need that team that mixes and matches to create a crazy combo to really stand out. So for our final Capcom team, I am grabbing characters from all over the place to create something brand new.
Fight!
I think I'll let you die before you know what hit you. How does that sound?
Yeah, time to make some cash.
Take off! That felt good, didn't it?
Team Fatale. For this final team, I want a collection of characters who had never worked together, but still fit a unifying theme. So that way, we could really take advantage of this three-person crossover format. And they need to be characters that were popular, characters who were big faces for the company, characters that when you look at them, you think of Capcom. And so, after many possible lineups, no, I'm not kidding, I came up with about 24 different possible teams for this final spot, and I seriously could have kept on going. So after all that brainstorming, I came up with a team of Morgan, Jury, and Poison to create Team Fatale. When it comes to popularity and name value, yeah, these three obviously fit the bill. Morgan is the face of Darkstalkers and has continued to live on as a major Capcom icon ever since that series ended. Heck, I had to not put her on Team Darkstalkers just so that other characters could finally get a minute on stage without her butting in and taking all the attention away from them. Then Jury is arguably the most popular new Street Fighter character from the last two generations of that game, and Poison started out as nothing but a random jobber in Final Fight, but built up such a fan following that they had to import her into Street Fighter just to keep her alive. So all three of them are big deals. But would they form a team together? I can totally see it. Morgan has always been about wanting to go down to the human world and have fun and start some mischief, so if she heard that there was a fighting tournament, I could see her wanting to sign up. But if she needed two teammates, then she would more than likely pick some humans to join her since, well, her credit with some of the other members of the Royal Demon family isn't so great. Dimitri and Jetta probably wouldn't want to sign up with her. So she would seek out humans who would have the same sadistic sense of entertainment that she does. Humans who have that same drive to take what they want and find great pleasure in doing it. And to me, that perfectly fits the crazed revenge-seeking Cheshire Cat Jury and the money and fame-hungry Poison. I can see this team butting heads amongst themselves, then drawing great pleasure from messing up anyone in their path. Plus, they even kind of have the same color scheme going for them. They might as well already be wearing Team Letterman jackets. And that brings us to the final SNK team, and I feel like we need a team that can match Team Fatale in tone. We've got a lot of heroes on the SNK side so far, but let's include a couple of anti-heroes, a couple of chaotic neutral characters. Characters who would serve as good, what's the word?
It's not too late!
Team Rivals. Yes, if you're an SNK fan, then I'm sure this entire time there's been one name that you have been searching for. Don't worry, there is no way I could leave out one of the most legendary anti-heroes in fighting game history. The Flame of the End himself, Iori Yagami, will indeed be storming his way back into this game, and he's bringing back his original team from King of Fighters, at least the name of it. Yes, over the last few King of Fighters games, Iori's paired up with Mature and Vice, and while these two have their fans, they really only work well in a pair. It feels unfair to split them up, even though they did that exact thing in the previous CVSs. But at the same time, if I include both of them, it feels almost like a waste of a spot since both of them have such similar personalities. So instead, we're going all the way back to King of Fighters 95, Iori's first appearance where he popped up specifically to be Kyo's rival, so much so that his team in the game was literally called Team Rivals. He paired up with Billy Kane, who was meant to be a rival to Terry Bogard, and Aiji Kisaragi, who was meant to be the rival to Ryo. And over the years, Billy Kane has remained a pretty prominent face for SNK, so he'll be sticking around, but Aiji has kinda dropped off the face of the earth. So we need a new third rival, and when it comes to SNK, that means another character with red hair. Don't know why that's a theme for the company, it just apparently is. And when you look at SNK's landscape for a good rival, the clear winner is Genjiro Kibagami, the brutal swordsman from Samurai Shodown who fights only for the joy of killing. Not only is he a major icon for the franchise, but with his cold blood and intimidating nature, he's probably the only character who could join this team who could stand face to face with Iori and not even flinch. And that brings us to the end of the regular roster. We now have a total of 48 characters, 24 on each side, but more importantly, 16 teams in order to take one of the themes of the previous CVS games and expand it to the next logical step. But we're not done yet. No, as I said, there would also be a few bosses, both from Capcom and SNK, just like in the previous games. But there wouldn't just be regular bosses. No, as I said, this game would take inspiration from the structure of King of Fighters, and a staple of that series is not just to have bosses, but mid-bosses as well. Yes, typically in King of Fighters, you get all the way to the end. You fought all your opponents, then you go up against the big boss, only to then learn that there is actually an even bigger boss right behind them. So for this game, we'll not only have two final bosses, one from both companies, but two sub-bosses right before them. And since this is a tradition with SNK, let's go ahead and start with their representative.
Wait a second. A new opponent has interrupted the tournament.
Silver. Before I go any further, let me just say, yes, I am aware of what a far out of left field obscure pick this is. Silver has only had 2 appearances ever. Once as the final boss of Baruki 1, a super rare mixed martial arts fighting game that was only ported to the dead Neo Geo 64 console and is so complex and hard to run, it's next to impossible to even emulate the freaking thing. And later as a secret character in King of Fighters 11. So yeah, not exactly a household name. However, I still have to put my foot down and demand he gets put in here as a sub-boss because, well damn, this guy is just too cool. Not only does he look like if the sensei from Cobra Kai just went out into the wilderness and punched mountains until he went insane, but his entrance is legendary. In Baruki 1, you make your way through a tournament, and when you finally reach the end, when you come to the Grand Championship, this mystery man just breaks down the doors, takes out the guy you were supposed to fight, flies into the ring, and then when you beat him, he just flies off without a word or a hint of what he was all about. That's just badass, and the fact that SNK isn't doing more with him is practically a crime. So yes, we are going to bring him back as our sub-boss, but there's one more reason why I'm picking him, because our Capcom sub-boss is going to be...
My fists bleed death. Welcome to your doom.
Akuma. Yeah, you might have heard the description of Silver's entrance and thought to yourself, wow, that really sounds like Akuma. Well, you're not wrong. Many people have drawn comparisons between the two, both wandering malicious murderers who look for strong opponents to fight, Both of them very mysterious figures. Both of them have intros where they take out the guy that you were supposed to fight. Yeah, they're practically parallel universe versions of each other. So I say we put these two in here as the sub-bosses. And you know how one of the best things about the last CVS was the character interactions, where certain characters would have specific lines or actions between each other before a match? I say, if you have Silver and Akuma face off, they both slide in from opposite sides of the screen, meet in the middle, everything goes black as a series of blows covers the screen, then they both appear with their backs to each other, unfazed and ready for the real fight. Just the idea of that scene makes me want to put them both in here. And I know some people will say it's unfair to bump Akuma down to being a sub-boss since he was one of the two big bosses of the last game, but we can't just copy and paste the same bosses, we need to spice things up a little bit. That being said, yeah, it's not like we can just leave Akuma out of this. He's too big to ignore, and I highly doubt the ultimate loner would be willing to join anyone's team. So yeah, making him a sub-boss is kind of really the only place we can find for him. But if Akuma is just a sub-boss this time, then who are our two new bosses? Hyo Imawano. If you have a Street Fighter character as the sub-boss, I can't exactly repeat that with just another one as the main boss. I know Gil seems like such an obvious choice, but I wanted to stretch our range a little further. So I grabbed Hyo Imawano from Rival Schools, a deadly swordsman who uses brainwashing technology to try and take over Japan. Yeah, if that's your MO, I could totally see someone like that trying to use a fighting tournament full of the strongest people in the world to his advantage. And if you watch the King of Fighters Destiny anime, then you know that brainwashing technology being used by the person running a tournament within an SNK game is actually kind of a semi-canonical thing. So it just kind of makes sense to have him slide in here. Heck, we could even have something in the arcade ladder or the story mode where the final team you face before the bosses would have special evil color schemes and red eyes, implying that they're under his mind control. And when it comes to his playstyle, not only do his swords provide him with crazy unfair range, but also he is insanely fast. So while most final bosses are just overload with physical strength, I want to balance things out a bit. So let's say that the upcoming SNK final boss is going to be a pillar of muscles, and Hyo is going to focus on speed. Also, as I said, Hyo came from Rival Schools, a series that was created by Hideaki Itsuno, the same mastermind behind the Capcom Vs SNK series, which would probably explain why a Rival Schools character was on the box of the last game. So even though Mr. Itsuno would probably not be returning for this game, I'd still love to include one of his biggest baddies as the final boss in here as a tribute to this legendary creator. And that leaves us with just one character left. And boy, were there a lot of great choices we could have gone with. But in the end, only one SNK character truly felt large and in charge enough to be worth the title Final Boss.
Bring it on. I'll destroy you all.
Geese Howard. Or should I say, Geese? Yes, one of the greatest villains in video game history has to be in this game. And as the big final wall you must face before you become the champ, seems like the perfect spot for him. Some people might be shocked to see him gain upgrade from regular fighter in the last game to the big boss, and I will admit I was tempted to put him on a team with Billy Kane and some of his other subordinates to be the SNK mirror to Team Shadaloo, but end of the day, Geese Howard just felt too important to not be some big grand presence in this tournament. With his malicious attitude, his overflowing bravado and ego, his immensely punishing attacks such as the Raging Storm, the Rapuken, and of course the dreaded Double Rapuken, all accompanied by one of the best theme songs in fighting game history, you better believe we're going to make Mr. Howard the big threat in this game. Now, as I said, those are your mid-bosses and your final bosses. However, if you are familiar with the last game, you might be expecting something right now. Something coming after the two final bosses, two secret bosses. What I'm referring to is that moment in CVS 2 where after you beat your final opponent, if you got a high enough score, then the sky would darken, lightning would crack, and then the two regular bosses in the game, Rugal and Akuma, would appear above you. charging at each other with bloodlust in their eyes as they engage in combat, and only one would appear victorious, absorbing the power of the other to become a brand new monstrous opponent. This was easily one of the most hype moments of any fighting game from this generation, and I would love to recreate that here. But we do need to make it different. I was very tempted to have Geese come back as the supercharged Nightmare Geese, and Hyo come back as the possessed Demon Hyo, but then we're just repeating ourselves, and some of the surprise is taken away. I want to keep the idea of you unlocking a super crazy secret boss if your score is high enough, but we need to change it up a bit. So here's my pitch. You beat the sub-boss, and that means that you get to go on and fight the final boss. But if your score is high enough, then when you arrive at the championship, you look up and you see Geese Howard falling down from his tower and crashing right into the middle of the ring, beaten to within an inch of his life. Your team looks up to see the sky open up, and down comes the true boss you have now unlocked. Neo Dio. Neo Dio might be a more obscure SNK boss, but he has a lot going for him. First off, he's a deranged entity that travels through time to find strong opponents to fight, meaning it would make sense for him to show up in here if you got a high enough score. Congratulations, you have now proved yourself throughout this tournament. And because you've now proved yourself, you've gotten the attention of this evil entity from beyond space and time. Also, he's from a lesser known but still very fun SNK series, World Heroes. Why is that important? Because World Heroes was all about a scientist who creates a time machine to bring strong contenders from different eras together to fight each other. And I know someone out there has been asking this whole time, okay, I know you say that there aren't realities opening up in here and that everybody comes from the same world, but you've got Samurai Showdown characters in here. How are you bringing fighters in from the past? Well, if Neo Dio is in here, bam, you just say it was the World Heroes time machine, done. And lastly, and the most niche reason for including him, Neo Dio's name is half a pun on the Neo Geo game console and on Dio from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and his design was heavily influenced by the works of JoJo's creator. And what company made the legendary 2D JoJo fighting game that still sees tournament play to this day? Capcom. I would love for some of the Capcom characters to have unique lines before the match with Neo Dio, where they just make very vague JoJo references just for that one hardcore Capcom nerd out there who would get it. Also, I should point out that Neo Dio can turn into a dragon, and that just makes him cool. I don't write the rules, it just does. But that's if you get a high enough score and you're using an SNK groove. What about if you're using a Capcom groove? Well, we already have a villain who travels through time looking to conquer strong foes. So how about someone that travels through space?
The Earth needs a ruler. If Pyron is needed, Pyron it shall have.
Pyron. Yes, we're swapping one amorphous intergalactic god for another. Pyron used to be one of the biggest final bosses in fighting game history, but he was from Darkstalkers, and Capcom is currently doing everything in their power to keep that game from coming back, so putting him in here as the true secret boss is about as good as we're going to get. Plus, he's one of the few Capcom final bosses that really fits the theme of an SNK final boss. By which I mean he appears out of nowhere, overflowing with energy, and he spams the entire screen constantly with... how should I phrase this delicately? Oh right, crazy bullshit. Yeah, SNK bosses are kinda known for teleporting everywhere, firing waves of energy blast nonstop, and being super aggressive, and Pyron fits that to a T. But there you have it, no more surprise bosses on the way, we now have our final roster. 48 regular characters and 6 possible bosses, which unintentionally means I think I just created 2 possible team bosses as well. Seriously, I didn't even mean to do that, it just kinda happened. Now, looking at this roster, I can't help but think, yeah, this is good. This covers a lot of bases, includes some new combinations and some classic lineups in here, and That's all well and good, and it still sticks to the theme that I wanted to give the game, but I can't help but wish that there was more. Yeah, I know that we can't make this roster any higher. For a modern-day fighting game to include over 50 characters is insane. Even if we repurpose elements from other games like the old CVS's did, this is still pushing it. So, as much as I would love to, I can't go any larger with the main roster. And it's a shame too, because there's so many more cool characters that we could include, so many great combinations that we could make. But what are you gonna do? Just add more characters? We couldn't possibly do that. Oh, right, we can totally do that. It's called DLC. Yes, this is the 1-year anniversary of Build the Roster, and you want to know something that's changed about me over the last year of doing this? I've come to really appreciate DLC in fighting games, because I can't tell you how many times I've been putting a roster together and I realize, oh, these characters are mandatory. We can't make a game without them. But now, there's no room for all the cool characters that we wanted to use. And boy, I was facing that problem with this game. I know someone is going to say, well, just make the roster bigger, but we can't do that. We have to be at least a bit realistic in here, and 48 regular characters and 6 bosses is as big as we could possibly get this thing. The SNK guys push themselves to the breaking points to make games with rosters that big, and let's be real, Capcom probably isn't going to put up too much money to help them with that. And I love this idea of making 3-person teams, but I will admit it does limit the number of characters even further. So yes, today, in order to really explore this big crazy crossover, we're going to cover the DLC. Now, if I had to take a guess, I'd say that we could probably squeeze 3 seasons out of this. That's a pretty standard number of DLC seasons today, and I think this game would be successful enough that getting 3 seasons is a pretty safe bet. And each season would include 6 characters. And I'll give you all a second to work the math on that and see that what I'm really suggesting isn't 6 characters, but 1 Capcom team and 1 SNK team each season. And since we kick things off in the regular roster with Capcom, let's switch things up and begin with SNK this time. New Faces Team. One thing you might have noticed from the roster is that we were a little light on new characters, so I figured we should make a team that is essentially Team King of Fighters 14. Then again, King of Fighters 15 is literally being promoted while we're making this video, so I probably should have saved this for our 2-year anniversary to get a more comprehensive list, but too late now. Yes, I wanted to put together a team made up of some of the more popular additions to the King of Fighters franchise in the 14th installment, and I'm using the name New Faces since it was a name used previously on a team of brand new characters. I mean, sure, it was revealed that that team was actually evil and working for the big villain of the entire game, but it's still a good name, darn it! Now, as for who to include, I decided to go with Alice, who SNK is trying really hard to push as their next big spokesperson, probably because she's the face of one of their pachinko machines. Next up is Luong, who, according to surveys, was actually the most used of the new characters in King of Fighters 14, so she's got a connection with players. And then there's Banderas, who... Listen, I'll just admit, I'm pulling favorites on this one because I just really love the Brazilian self-taught ninja. Now, as for why these 3 would be on a team together, well, that's kind of a tough one. I mean, none of them have anything at all in common with each other. But the more I thought about, the more I realized there actually is a great explanation for why this team would form. Alice is Terry Bogard's biggest fan and wants to be just like him. And who did I say would be on Terry's team in Capcom Vs SNK 3? Kim and Mai. And Luong is Kim's master's girlfriend, who Kim feels very uncomfortable around. And Banderas wants to be a ninja more than anything in the world and has even tried in the past to get Mai to be his sensei. So I could totally see Alice wanting to copy Terry so much that she ends up grabbing up characters who are closely connected to his 2 teammates. I will admit I put this team together just based on their popularity, but I ended up creating the Bizarro Team Fatal Fury. What can I say, sometimes these themes just write themselves.
Go for broke!
We are all one. There is just one Earth, and it is very precious. All citizens of Earth, every one of them must fight.
I shall present the prophecy!
Power to the Earth! Light it up. I have the power of fire.
Team Earth Power. Okay, remember how I said SNK's side was a little light on new characters? Well, Capcom's side is practically barren. Which there's a reason for that. As I said, Capcom Vs SNK is specifically meant to be a celebration of fighting games from both companies, and since the last CVS 20 years ago, Capcom has released... yeah, not a whole lot of anything. A couple of crossover games and 2 new Street Fighter installments. Yeah, Capcom has certainly moved away from their fighting game division, and that's resulted in far fewer characters to pull from. However, from the little we have gotten, there have been a handful of standout stars who won people over, and if I'm going to have a team that is essentially Team King of Fighters 14, then I need what would essentially be Team Street Fighter 5. And when I think of the characters who were popular in that game, Rashid instantly stands out. I mean, if there was one new character who Capcom was really pushing to be a big deal in the game and in the story mode, it was him. Plus, he's got a super fun personality that would be great to bounce off of other characters, and his crazy hopping and jumping actions would fit in well with any of the SNK grooves. Then Minot has certainly become a fan favorite, and her crystal ball traps would make her a very unique combatant. But when it came to the third character, it was kind of tough. I mean, the obvious choice would be Laura, or maybe Colleen, but instead, I'm going in the complete opposite direction of them and picking G. First off, I love his big crazy persona, some YouTuber who goes around claiming to be the president of Earth. What's not to love about that? Secondly, he actually draws his power from the Earth itself, and you know who else does that? Some pretty big important SNK characters. So I would love to see the interactions he would have with them. And most importantly, he actually has a reason to pair it with Minot and Rashid. In G's story mode in Street Fighter V, both Rashid and Minot become aware of him when they see his videos online, and they decide to challenge him before he beats them down easily. So I could see G wanting to join this tournament to help spread his message of unity on the biggest stage in the world, but he needs teammates. So he snatches up the 2 people who helped him rise in popularity to begin with, Rashid and Minot. Plus, imagine how fun it would be if they almost took on a Kim Kapwan, Chang and Choi style relationship, where Minot and Rashid clearly do not want to be there, but G is so powerful and so crazy, they don't want to mess with him. So every single time that he turns his back, Rashid and Minot just look at each other and go, okay, this guy is clearly nuts, right? We have to get out here. Then G turns back around and they flip on a dime. Oh yeah, power to the Earth, you said it, big guy. No, seriously, he is insane.
Live and let die.
Mission 1, start. Mission complete.
Team Agents. This team might as well be called Team Fan Favorites, and out of all the DLC teams, this is the one that hurt the most not being able to include them. Which is almost appropriate since Team Agents has kind of become known in the KOF community as Team Why Aren't They Here? Yeah, they've got some of the most popular characters in the game's history, and yet they haven't officially been included since KOF 11. And then Vanessa and Blue Mary were brought back for King of Fighters 14, but only as DLC. And sadly, due to other teams being more important to the history of these companies and this franchise, they'll have to sell for being DLC once again. Now, as for who to include, I'm of course going to bring back Vanessa, stylish boxer badass and pretty much the face of Team Agents. Then there's Blue Mary, sleek and cool detective who has been one of the longest running characters in SNK's history. And for the final slot, well, nothing against Seth or Ramon, the other 2 members of Team Agents, but I figured this would be another good time to expand and find a series that hasn't yet been represented. Especially if it's a series from SNK's history that has continued to hold on to a strong fan base throughout the years. I'm talking about Metal Slug, SNK's side-scrolling shooter series. Now, I know you might think this makes no sense including a character from this game because its cast doesn't quite fit the fighting game format. You know, because of all the guns. And I will admit that means we would have to change up their playstyles and get creative with them to make it work, but it could be done. I mean, it's not like this would be the first time a team from a shooter series joined the KOF circuit. Team Ikari Warriors blasted their way through that barrier decades ago, so there is a precedence for it on the SNK side. And fans have been asking for a Metal Slug character to be in a King of Fighters game for years now. At least in an official King of Fighters game, since Fio did appear in the non-canon Maximum Impact series, where she could best be described as ear-shattering. So yeah, we need to do the Metal Slug series right after that, and while I will admit pretty much any of them would fit in this slot, I'm going to stick with Fio because when I look around the web, she seems to be the most popular choice, and as I said, we cannot let this be her only fighting game appearance.
That's what we like to call big damage.
Team Otherworld. As I have said over and over again, this game is meant to be a celebration of these companies' fighting games, and there are so many great Capcom franchises to choose from. No way could I give each of them a team. So, why not just put them all together on one team? If you're an SNK fan, then you might recognize the name of this team. In King of Fighters 14, there was a team made up of characters from other games set outside of the King of Fighters universe, and their leader was Love Heart, a pirate who traveled between worlds. Gee, if only Capcom had their own cross-dimensional pirate. Oh wait, they do. Ruby Heart. Shockingly enough, no relation. In Marvel Vs Capcom 2, they introduced Ruby Heart, and even though that game wasn't heavy on story, it was implied that her ship was what allowed the heroes of these multiple worlds to come together to stop this big evil enemy. So you know what, for this next team, let's really lean to the crossover element with a Capcom team that is a direct reference to an SNK team. Have Ruby Heart, this dimension-traveling pirate, decide to enter the tournament for her own reasons, and she needs some powerful fighters, so she grabs up Rouge from Power Stone and Tessa from Red Earth. Now, I'm grabbing Tessa because even though Red Earth had a short run in the arcades and never got ported to anything, Tessa herself has been ported to lots of things. She popped up as a playable character in Super Gym Fighters and in SNK's crossover game SVC Chaos, as well as making small cameo appearances all over the place. She's one of the many Capcom characters doomed to never see her series return, and yet she continues to come back again and again, so let's go ahead and make her come back again and again. And next, I want to give Power Stone some love. I mean, the game was made by Hideaki Itsuno, the same guy who made the previous Capcom Vs SNK games, and you can tell he really wanted a Power Stone character in here. He loaded the status up with cameo appearances from them. So let's make that dream come true and put one of their characters in here, and while I know Falcon might seem like the obvious choice since he was the protagonist of those games, Rouge was certainly one of the more fan-favorite characters, and I think that her more magical presence would fit beside Tessa and Ruby. She feels like a more natural addition to these two than any of the other characters in that game. Now there is something else about these three that makes me really excited for this team, which is I feel this team would show off the groove systems better than any other team I've mentioned so far. For example, let's look at Tessa. Tessa came from Red Earth, a game where as you play through the arcade ladder, you would have an experience bar that would level up, and each time that leveled up, you would have access to higher level abilities and skills. So, maybe some of the grooves that we invent for this game would implement various gauges and modes that you could enter, and each time that you activate the special abilities of these grooves, Tessa would then basically level up, and she would now have access to higher level skills. Rouge would fight in her human form for most of the game, but when she activates some of the Groove's special abilities, she could then transform into her Power Stone form to use stronger versions of her specials. And Ruby Heart is in here to represent the Versus series, however she was originally meant to be a character from Darkstalkers. So maybe her and all the other Darkstalkers characters could have special stage shift abilities that are tied to some of the grooves, for example any groove that grants you an enhancement ability such as Max Mode, but if you're using a groove that gives you access to a unique one-time move, then she could quickly call in one of her teammates for an assist attack, just like you could do in the Versus games. I know that throughout the course of this video I didn't go into a lot of details about how each character would change up depending on what grooves you pick for them, but I would like to see at least a few characters really spicing things up and seeing their gameplay change fairly dramatically based on which group you pick, and I think this team is great for showing that off.
You can feel the calm before the storm as the round begins.
Team Orochi. And for the final SNK team, I'm looking at what we currently have, and if there's one thing from the SNK side that we're lacking, it's villains. Sure, we have team rivals, but even then we need something a bit darker. Characters that aren't rivals or anti-heroes or morally gray, no, they're just bad guys. And when it comes to SNK, when I think of villains, I think of Orochi. So I'm collecting together 3 characters who have at some point in their history worked for or possessed the power of Orochi. And I know some of the deep SNK lore fans are looking at this team right now and they're saying to themselves, those 3 characters wouldn't work together. And you're right, they probably wouldn't, but we're on the final season of DLC. At this point, we're just looking for an excuse to include whatever fan favorite characters we can. And fan favorite is right, these are 3 big name characters in the KOF scene. You got Yamazaki, a mob enforcer who has an arm that possesses the power of Orochi, and the only reason that power doesn't overwhelm him is because he's too crazy for it. Then there's Shermie, a fun-loving rock star who might not seem like a villain at first, but because she's of the Orochi bloodline, she did try to destroy the entire world in order to make way for her dark god. I know some people will argue that she's given up her dark ways, but she can still be pretty malicious and deadly when she's provoked. Plus, we could have her transform into her Orochi form as a super move or as a groove ability. And lastly, we had to fit Rugal in here somewhere. He does have a tie to Orochi since he's got some of Orochi's power inside of him and even used that power to come back as Omega Rugal. But real talk, the reason for putting him on this team isn't what matters. Hell, we could just as easily have called this Team Outlaws or Team Villains because the important thing is we got Rugal in here. He and Akuma were the 2 massive big bad guys of the last game, so if we're putting Akuma in here, we had to get to Rugal eventually, and as the final SNK character to be revealed would be the ultimate way to send this game off. It would be that perfect final cherry to put on top of this sundae. That final thing to get people talking. And that's kind of the point of the final DLC character. You kind of want to save your big gun for the end to make even the people who swore off this game perk their heads up. This is your last chance to get people interested. And speaking of that, I can tell there's still a lot of people out there listening to this video who aren't on board. They're still not buying what I'm selling. They don't like our focus on fighting and arcade games. They don't like the 3-person structure and all the other crazy limitations I put in place. So, let's see if our final Capcom team can win you over.
Oh man, are you ready for this?
Devil May Cry.
Team Devil May Cry. Yes, I know people wanted Dante and his whole crew in this game. I know they did because I kept hearing about it anytime I brought up the idea of a CVS 3. And I understand why. The Devil May Cry characters are cool. They're great spokespeople for Capcom, and Dante has been overwhelmingly dominant in the last 2 Marvel games. But that's also why I didn't think I could include them. As I said, this is not a game with triple-digit combos and high-flying extreme supers, and that's kind of what Dante is built for. I mean, compare some high-level Marvel gameplay to some high-level CVS gameplay. Yeah, these are very different beasts, and I don't know if the Devil May Cry crew would fit in here. But this is our final DLC pack, and generally as a rule, if there is any time to go all out and over the top, It's in the final DLC pack. Hell, Dragon Ball FighterZ introduced a character with an insta-kill as their final DLC character. I'm pretty sure that wasn't in their initial pitch meeting for the game. But screw it, it's the final character, so let's go nuts. So, for the final DLC pack in Capcom Vs SNK 3...
This party's getting crazy. Let's rock.
Now, don't get me wrong, we would have to nerf Dante significantly from how he played in Marvel in order to fit into this game, but you could still make that work. And as for who to choose as his teammates, listen, there's a lot of great DMC characters I could throw in here, but did you play Devil May Cry 5? That game literally gave us a built-in 3-person team in Dante, Nero, and V. Now, I know that some people might be wondering how V could be in here since he, well, let's just say he probably isn't going to be sticking around for Devil May Cry 6. But hey, this is a crossover fighting game. None of this is canon to begin with. Besides, we already said that we're including Neo Dio as a secret boss, a character who is tied to time travel. Just say that his presence brought back characters who had already been erased, and now V knows that he must assemble a team to face this monster in the tournament. And before anyone points out in the comments, yes, I know that Dante has another 3-person team in Trish and Lady, but Nero is the current new hotness. We kind of have to include him, so V just makes sense since they already were a 3-person team. Plus, as I said, we would have to nerf these characters to make them fit into the format of a fighting tournament, and Lady's entire moveset is just guns. Yeah, fighting tournaments like the King of Fighters and Street Fighter, they tend to be pretty fast and loose on things like swords or fireballs, but it would just feel too weird for a character to just pull out bazookas and machine guns in the ring. Plus, again, V is another character who would work great with different groove systems. His entire moveset is that he summons out familiars to fight for him, so you could have those familiars be affected by whatever groove that you're in. So yeah, this kind of has to be our Team Devil May Cry. And there you finally have it, your complete roster. We now have a grand total of 72 characters, including the bosses and the DLC, making 22 regular teams and 6 bosses left over. This is easily the largest roster that we have ever put together. I have nothing else to give. I am completely spent, and nothing else needs to be said. Well, almost. We're still missing something. It wouldn't be a build the roster if I didn't throw in at least one last thing. Yes, as I have said over and over and over again, to the point where I have driven it into the ground and the words no longer mean anything anymore, the whole reason I'm picking characters based around the 3-person team layout is because I'm taking the team mechanics of the previous games and I am now merging it with a format based around King of Fighters. But as some of you might not be aware, in several King of Fighters installments, they would have the official teams, but then they would also have secret teams that you could make by mixing and matching specific characters, which they refer to as special edit teams. Now what happens if you pick a special edit team is that after you take them into arcade mode and you beat the game, you would unlock special artwork made just for that team. It's a small thing, but it's fun. It's a nice little surprise and leads players to experiment and try out new combinations. Well, I say bring that back for this game as well, and I think both Capcom and SNK would be down with this idea, since Capcom loads Street Fighter V to the roof with secret artwork that you can unlock in arcade mode by pulling off special accomplishments. However, I would change things up a bit. As I said, in order to unlock this artwork, you would have to beat arcade mode with your team, but I'd hate to force people to just keep playing through arcade mode again and again and again. I think these days most fighting game fans spend a majority of their time online, so how about now you can unlock this art if you just play a certain number of matches with these teams, and those matches could be online or offline. Also, maybe you could include more than just art. For example, how about you unlock special colors for the 3 members of your team, to make it feel like everyone is now wearing matching team jerseys. And in arcade mode, as I've said a few times, we'd bring back the character interactions at the start of matches, but we can now extend that to include interactions between specific teams. So maybe we could make some special interactions just for these secret teams. It wouldn't have to be anything huge. I mean, yes, sometimes it could involve the entire team, but other times it could be one line from a fighter about why they're working with these other characters, or their thoughts about these very odd teammates that they now find themselves with. Just to add some secret dialogue that would encourage players to pick and choose to see what they can unlock. For example, Billy Kane would have a few unique interactions with various characters, especially Terry Bogard. That would be true no matter what team he's on, or even if he's on no team and you're playing solo as him. But if he's on Team Rivals, then his team would have a few special interactions with other teams, such as Team Fatale, as I hinted at above. But if you put Billy on a team with Yamazaki and Geese, then now you've unlocked Team Southtown, and now they have special interactions with other characters that reflect this new team. Or the whole team might have a special interaction with someone else, such as Team Shadowloo, and you see Geese staring down Bison as Billy and Yamazaki square off with Vega and Balrog. So what would these teams be, you might ask? Well, as you can tell from the example I just gave, there would be plenty of teams comprised of characters within the same company, but where's the fun in that? Yes, you would now get to make special edit teams made up of characters from both universes, and I'm not going to run down all of them because God knows this video has gone on long enough and I came up with a lot of them, but here's some of the more notable ones that I dreamed up. Team Eternal Warriors, made up of Kyo, Ryu, and Ryo. Aside from having names that are one step away from each other, these three characters have been three big protagonists in fighting games and are united by their need to constantly train in their struggle to be the best. Team China, made up of Chun-Li, Shun'ei, and Hisinko. If you know King of Fighters, then you know one of the biggest uniting themes for teams is country of origin. And the last installment introduced us to Shun'ei's team, Team China. So let's bring in two Capcom characters to help him represent his home country. There's tons of other country-related teams that you can make up as well, such as Dudley, Billy Kane, and Bijane on Team England, Kushnud, Banderas, and Blanca on Team Brazil, and Terry Bogard, Ken Masters, and Alex on Team Team Boxer, made up of Dudley, Balrog, and Vanessa. Pretty self-explanatory, they're three of the biggest boxers in fighting game history, plus they'd have some great interactions. Nobody on this team is even remotely close to each other in terms of personality, so it'd be great to see them bounce off each other in some secret interactions. In fact, speaking of Balrog, let's also pair him and Vega up with Kim Kapwan as a brand new Team Korean Justice. For anyone who doesn't know, one of Kim's big running gags is that he believes in reforming criminals, so he forces villains to work alongside him, and he's so strong that they can't escape his brutal training program. So let's put Vega and Balrog on his team, and if they go up against Bison, they could have a special interaction where they beg him to take them back, and they can finally escape their crazy Taekwondo master. And after you play a certain number of matches with him, you can unlock special colors for Balrog and Vega that would closely resemble Kim's white and blue gi, or you can unlock some special artwork for them that shows Kim exercising the two of them to their breaking point. Speaking of teams with good interactions, as I said, Dan Hibiki was meant to be a parody of Ryo, but his hairstyle came from Ryo's partner, Robert Garcia. So let's take Kushnud off Team Art of Fighting, substitute Dan in there, and now Ryo and Yuri would have special interactions with King, where she asks them why Robert is acting so weird, and the two of them say, "Yeah, I don't know, he's been wearing this pink gi recently, and he's talking all strange, we don't know what's up with him." Speaking of King, she always wanted to lead a team of all-female characters to show the world how strong women could be, and in Street Fighter, Chun-Li is literally known as the world's strongest woman, so put Chun-Li on a team with King, throw in King's old teammate Mai, and now Team Women Fighters has evolved into its final form, Team World's Strongest Women Fighters. Let's also have pop idol Athena team up with rock musician Shermie and dance superstar Felicia for Team Showtime, and you get special artwork afterwards of the three of them putting on a concert for everyone, as well as unlocking a new musical track that you could listen to in the gallery or play in the background whenever you select this team. Want something a bit more serious? How about Batsu, Nero, and Rock Howard on Team Sins of the Father, where they have special dialogue with Geese Howard, where Batsu and Nero tell Rock that he doesn't have to be defined by the evils of his family, since the two of them can speak from experience. Put Ryu, Akuma, and Iori on a team together, and after playing a certain number of matches with them, you'll unlock colors themed around Shin Akuma, Dark Ryu, and Orochi Iori. And as I said, this would be just like CVS 2, so you wouldn't have to have 3 characters on every single team. There would be a couple of special edit teams that would only require 2 characters. For example, if you had M. Bison and Athena on a team together, you could create Team Psycho Power, and your reward would be a new color for Athena that would put her in an M. Bison color palette and change the color of her energy to make it a darker purple, essentially unlocking a version of Athena that uses M. Bison's Psycho Power instead of her own Psycho energy. And there's so many more combinations, I'm not even halfway done with everything that I thought of. Team Muscle Power made up of Alex, Hagar, and Tizok. Team Pirate made up of Bijane, Darlie Dagger, and Ruby Heart. Team Youthful Spirits made up of Sakura, Hinata, and Alice. Team Ninja made up of Mai, Banderas, and Guy. Team Fortunes made up of Tessa, Minot, and Nakaruru. Team Taekwondo made up of Kim, Luong, and Juri. Team Protege made up of Sakura, Makoto, and Yuri. As I said, I could keep going on and on and on and on and on. But there's no need to continue because you all get the point. You're probably already thinking up your own special edit teams down below because, as I said, that's part of the fun of this idea. Just brainstorming what could exist and mixing and matching to see what themes you could come up with. And I'm hoping that this roster provide players with enough variety, enough returning favorites, enough new faces, enough standard entries, and enough weird picks to make for a great Capcom vs SNK 3. Again, I know some people are upset that we stuck so close to fighting game characters and played into the team format, but as I said, I thought that added a lot to this game while staying true to the themes of the originals. But if you are upset about that, then don't worry. It's not like this is the only series where these two franchises crossed over. Remember, SNK did their own take on this premise with SVC Chaos, which saw single fighters and characters from a wide range of games. Does this mean that one day we're going to do a build a roster for SVC Chaos 2? Well, let's just say I have a few ideas up my sleeve.
Like what?
I'd really rather not get into that right now.
Why not?
Okay, fine. We have no ideas for SVC Chaos 2. We got nothing. Happy?
No.
Let me know what you thought of this roster and all the other bizarre ideas I threw out here below. As you could probably tell, this episode took a lot of work, so if you enjoy this, then give us a thumbs up and share us around the web. It sure does help us out. Also, if you're new here, then check out all of our other Build the Rosters and other videos. As I said, it's now been 1 year since we started this crazy experiment, and I really do want to thank everyone who has supported us over this time. We just passed 10,000 subscribers, and I can't wait to see how much more we grow in the upcoming year. Remember, if you want to know more about upcoming shows and everything else that we have planned, then you can keep up to date with me on Twitter at Thorgy's Arcade, or you can follow us on Twitch at Professor Thorgy to catch early drafts of these shows. Thanks again for tuning in, everyone. Stay safe out there, and come back next time.